The China and Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on Africa-China relations through innovative training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.co.za.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Network from SupChina. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by Cobus van Staden, the senior China-Africa researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good morning to you, Cobus.
Good morning.
Cobus, today we're going to talk tech, and we're going to go to the question of Huawei and ZTE and Chinese tech in Africa. It's one of the most fascinating aspects of the Chinese-African engagement story, but one that we haven't really explored as much as we should have this year. If you recall, at the beginning of the year, Cobus, we said that this was going to be the year of China-Africa tech. We had an interview with our friend Stephanie Zhu in Nairobi. That was all before COVID and everything that's happened, so tech kind of fell away a little bit, but a lot of things are happening, and that's why I'm really excited about today's show. Let me take you back before we get into kind of Huawei and these details of what's going on in Africa to October. And Bonnie Glick, who was the then deputy administrator at the U.S. Agency for International Development, I say then because she was just fired by Donald Trump. And so she's no longer with USAID. She's now at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She was very excited about a new program that the United States government was unveiling to challenge Huawei in developing countries. And what they were going to do is offer all of this new money to basically try and persuade network and telecom operators in places like Africa to uninstall their existing Huawei equipment and ZTE gear, and then to buy equipment from, say, Ericsson or Samsung from so-called friendly countries. It was the most boneheaded, stupid idea that's come out of the U.S. government in a long time. And I like the reaction that Jude Moore at the Center for Global Development had on Twitter. He said, if the U.S. government goes ahead with this, it forces Huawei to drive down its prices or add sweeteners to its ICT deals, delivering greater value for money in price-sensitive Africa. I am here for this. So he was really making fun of what USAID was doing there, because you're never going to beat the Chinese on price, especially a company like Huawei that has the state behind it in terms of access to public financing. So if the U.S. comes in on a Monday and says, we'd like to offer you money to take out your gear or to buy Samsung equipment, the Chinese will come back on Tuesday and say, what did they offer you on Monday? We'll double it. And that's what Jude was talking about. But it shows you, I think, in one sense, really the lack of understanding that the United States has in its efforts to try and push back against Huawei and ZTE and Chinese tech. Because what it reveals is that they're focusing on just those two things. And that really is the tip of the iceberg. Underneath the water, there's this massive, massive iceberg. Let me tell you about what's going on in Africa today. That Chinese companies right now, in the latest data that I saw from IDC, have about 49% market share of the entire African smartphone market. 49%, 1 out of 2. Most of that is dominated by one company, Transsion. Then there's another company called Boomplay, which many people outside of Africa have never heard of. It has 75 million users. That makes it one of the largest music streaming services in the world. And just to give you some context here, Spotify has 286 million users with 130 million subscribers. Apple Music has 72 million subscribers, and Amazon Music has 55 million subscribers. Now, there's a difference between users and subscribers, but regardless, Boomplay is right up there with the big brands. And what's interesting is when you look at the statistics about the largest streaming services in the world, they almost never feature Boomplay. And it's one of the only areas in the world, and I think maybe the only one that I can think of, where Apple and Spotify are getting their butts kicked. And Africa is this place where Boomplay is by far the dominant player right there. So then there was another interesting story that crossed earlier this month about Huawei and their new Mate 40 phone. This is a new smartphone, and it launched in Africa. In South Africa, Kenya, and Nigeria were the major markets where it launched. Now, it's a very expensive phone. It's one of their top-tier premium phones. But for the first time, it came pre-installed with a built-in e-wallet that uses China's digital yuan, or its cryptocurrency. And that was super interesting. And that's what prompted me to think, okay, we have got to start thinking about how we reinterpret Chinese tech in Africa because cryptocurrencies, blockchain, these new technologies are going to be the battlegrounds that the Chinese are fighting for. And it reveals again why the U.S. obsession with Huawei in many ways is so misled because, Cobus, the integration of Chinese tech in Africa goes far beyond Huawei.
Yeah, it's and even if you look at Huawei's own work in Africa, it's happening at almost every level. Kind of from selling handsets all the way up the chain to undersea cable provision. In a situation where African consumers are leapfrogging all over the place, trying to get into the newest technologies, and African states are looking to upgrade a bunch of different kind of networks and systems at the same time. So this goes from rolling out just cell phone networks all the way to smart city projects. The Chinese players are involved in all of those at the same time, and it then actually doesn't make a lot of sense to target one of them. The issue is actually is where Africa is in relation to the internet. It's a very exciting moment for Africa, but a very kind of complicated one for people who want to try and kind of reroute it in a different direction.
So we want to get some perspective on the Chinese role throughout the entire what we call the technology stack, and that's every single layer of the technology ecosystem in Africa and what role Chinese companies are playing there to get some perspective on whether or not the focus on Huawei by the United States and others is right and what it means in terms of where technology is going right now in Africa. And for that, we couldn't have a better person. Michael Kimani, I'm so glad we were able to connect with him. He builds fintech, blockchain, and digital currency products. He's advising East African governments on blockchain. He is also working closely with big multinational finance companies like Visa, fintech startups like Zippy, which we'll find out a little bit more about, and also nonprofits like the Blockchain Association of Kenya. And also, by the way, he gets a lot of attention for his writing on the subject that he does on his blog, Kiyoneki, and also that he shares on Twitter. And we're going to talk about a graphic that he did for us, which was absolutely fascinating. So, Michael, good morning to you in Nairobi, and thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Eric. I'm glad we connected. Good morning from Nairobi.
You wrote this graphic that you published on Twitter and then that you revised after our conversation about the East Africa Chinese digital stack. Can you talk to us a little bit about and try and verbally paint the picture for us about the technology stack that's in East Africa and what that means and what layers have Chinese technology in it?
Thank you for the introduction. I've been working a lot around studying the digital economy of East Africa for the last maybe 7 years. And I think at some point I started, in my work, I came across a lot of Chinese influence in things like the mobile phones that people were using as far back as 2014. And over time, it started to become apparent that there was a lot of Chinese technology that we were using, not just at the consumer level, but also at the commercial level, like with telecommunications companies, also at the government level, with things like data centers, with things like surveillance equipment. And then it's just been intensifying and moving further and further up what I call the Chinese stack into things like mobile applications that people use for playing music, like you mentioned, Boomplay, payment applications like fintech apps for making payments cross-border. So I just started getting curious as to what the hell is going on, And I think the sketch you saw was like me trying to dig deeper and see how much of East Africa's technology, and I call it a technology stack because I'm looking at it from the undersea cable that brings internet connection to East Africa from the rest of the world. I'm looking at telecommunication companies like Safaricom and MTN that offer people connection for making calls and accessing the internet. I'm looking at the handsets, the mobile handsets that people use for making calls and connecting to the telecommunication companies. So pretty much just starting from the base foundation of how people connect to the rest of the world through the internet and how that goes all the way up to the applications that they use every day, whether it's for listening to music or making payments or even dating sites. And I guess that's what led to the image that you shared in your article, the image that I shared with you about the Chinese, how the Chinese are influencing East Africa's digital stack. And it's pretty interesting. I think my summary so far and what I've been telling a lot of the people that I work with is it seems that the Chinese have had something like a swarm intelligence, where all the Chinese companies, it's as if they have a common strategy to penetrate as much of East Africa's digital stack from different angles. So what you discover is like the undersea cable that's coming to Africa, to East Africa, there's Chinese telecoms that's part of the company that's bringing this undersea cable to East Africa. When you go to the next layer, which is telecommunication companies, for example, you find that Huawei has over 60% or 50% presence in providing equipment for these companies. So there's a lot of equipment provided by Chinese companies to these telecommunication companies. Then when you move up the stack to the mobile handsets, you realize over 60%, close to 60% of the smartphone market in East Africa is dominated by Chinese companies. And it's worse because even the feature phones, like what people get before they can afford a smartphone, the Chinese also have close to 50% market share in that segment as well. And then you start looking at the applications that are coming up. You start noticing that there's a lot of Chinese capital coming in through venture arms like Future Hub, like Transsion, and then investing into applications that a lot of young East African use, like music applications, like Boomplay that you mentioned. So Eric, what I discovered is, and this is the sketch I shared with you, is it's as if at every level of the East Africa's digital stack, there is a heavy Chinese presence, and I don't think it is coincidental. I think it seems like it's a carefully crafted strategy to just attack this digital stack from multiple angles.
Michael, you mentioned fintech, and obviously, in some fintech applications, particularly in micropayments, Africa is a world leader. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what the extent and the nature is of Chinese investment in this sector, and then also, kind of how Chinese payment applications, how are they coexisting with African payment applications like M-Pesa?
Yeah, so I think one of the most known cases of Chinese investing in fintech applications in Africa has been Palm Pay, but there's also been less, like Tencent. Tencent is invested in a company called Paystack, which is also a payment company. And generally, there's been an explosion of fintech applications in Africa because everyone is sort of trying to capture the young population that's emerging, that's moving into the internet through smartphones. And for the past maybe 5, 6, 7 years, there's been an explosion of fintech ventures, fintech startups that I would say are trying to build on what M-Pesa initially started. So M-Pesa, I'd call it like a low-level kind of payment system, but it doesn't really work well when you go to the internet. So these fintech startups have sort of emerged to bridge payments for the online world. And I think one of the things that I've observed is there's a lot of trade that happens generally between East Africa and China, and there seems to be a concerted effort by fintech companies, like, for example, WapiPay, which has an investment from Transsion through its venture arm known as Future Hub. They are trying to bridge the gap between how would you send money from East Africa to China if you wanted to quickly execute a trade on Alibaba, for example. So if you look at East Africa, you can see there's a channel that allows you to make payments from East Africa to Alibaba through M-Pesa. You can make payments through WapiPay. You can make payments through a company known as Flutterwave. So these fintech companies have identified that there's a large amount of volumes of trade between East Africa and China, And so they are investing heavily in things like partnerships, in enabling digital payments between those two regions. And what's even more interesting is that these Chinese companies are super aggressive about identifying these partnership opportunities. They're not shy about reaching out to fintech companies and investing in fintech companies like WapiPay. And most recently, PalmPay has probably been their biggest attempt at trying to become a dominant force in the fintech ecosystem. So PalmPay is a fintech startup under Transion, which is one of the owns like 50% of the market share of phones in Africa. So I would say there's a lot of partnerships to enable payments for trade. There's investments from China going into fintech companies. There's a concerted effort to try and have Chinese companies also become a player in Africa's and East Africa's fintech space.
Before we go much further in the discussion, I just think I need to put out onto the table the concern that Americans have about Chinese technology in general, Huawei in particular. And there's this sense in Washington when I'm there and I talk to people who are involved in this fight, and they say, well, don't people in Kenya and Africa understand the risks that they're taking by using Huawei technology? And the concern is that in Huawei, and again, this probably applies to all Chinese tech in the minds of many Americans and some Europeans, that because of the close relationship between these companies and the Communist Party, and because that they are subject to Chinese domestic laws that require them to hand over information about customers and to be able to create, this is the American allegation, there's never been any proof of it, but backdoors into the networking equipment so that they can potentially surveil, monitor, do all sorts of different things in the event that they need to, should the Chinese government or the Communist Party ask them to do so. When you talk to companies, government leaders, and others in the East African tech space that you work in, is there concern about Chinese technology and security the way that the Americans are articulating it?
I think there is like maybe small pockets from activists who are usually mostly anti any mega tech platforms like Facebook or Twitter. So generally activists here, they'll attack anything that looks big, you know. But I would say that a lot of people here are super practical about the Chinese relations, you know. Let me tell you that my first smartphone about 10 years ago, about 10, 12 years ago, was Huawei, was a Huawei Ideos. Before that, we had like some smartphones that didn't really have Android. They were like the earliest versions of smartphones, and most of them were Chinese. So the Chinese and Huawei are pretty much responsible for enabling us East Africans to even remotely consider owning a decent smartphone, you know? So when we talk about East Africa's digital success, digital economy success, I think most of us agree that it is built on Huawei and Chinese technology and Chinese smartphones. And I think most people are practical about that, you know? Most of us here, a lot of us own Chinese smartphones. They work pretty well for us. They're affordable. They have, it's easy to find parts for them. And this is something that you haven't seen from any American company, you know? Very few of us can afford iPhones from Apple. So I think a lot of us are realistic about the role that China has played in enabling a lot of us to become more connected to the rest of the world. That said, however, I do meet some people, for example, who have worked in the telcos industry, deep in the telcos industry, who had this kind of foresight, because they've seen for a while how the Huawei's have been taking over East Africa's telcos infrastructure, and they don't seem to like the fact that that companies like Huawei don't bother much about knowledge transfer, or they're not really here to help us develop. It's as if they're here for their own commercial interests, you know. So I'd say majority of us, I think, are more practical. We can see the types of Huawei Chinese companies have been good for us, but there are pockets of activists and people who are insiders in the industry who are maybe not too pleased by approach by Huawei and some of the Chinese companies.
Let me just add to that very quickly, Cobus, before I get to your question. My Broadband, which is a website in South Africa, did a survey of South Africa's telco providers who are doing 5G, and they asked them after this proposal by Bonnie Glick in the U.S. Agency for International Development to subsidize a replacement for Huawei equipment, whether or not they liked or disliked Huawei equipment. Rain, which is a mobile data provider, said, quote, Rain has no reason to believe that Huawei equipment specifically carries increased security risks compared to other vendors. Vodacom said to date there has been no public documented evidence of any security issues with Huawei network equipment. So the view in South Africa seems to be very similar to that in East Africa as well.
Yeah, I mean, on top of that, there's just this, I think African frugality just revolts against the idea of ripping out perfectly good equipment and replacing it when there's so many other parts of the continent that still has no internet at all. So I think there's just a part of it that just goes against all development thinking in Africa. Michael, I wonder if we could hone in a little bit on the payment technologies. Like in the case of say the case where you use either a Chinese or an African payment service to buy something on Alibaba from, say, Kenya, what currency is that transaction happening in? And then kind of what is the more general thinking around the impact of all of these technologies on national currencies in Africa?
I would say from this side, the fintech companies or the payment companies trying to offer services to East Africans who are shopping on Alibaba, and this is something that a lot of East Africans are shopping for Alibaba, whether it's for their own personal use. A lot of them are shopping for as resellers or as micro SMEs. So the companies offering these services kind of have to make it super easy for users to make payments on these platforms abroad. So, for example, if you're making a payment on Alibaba or AliExpress with M-Pesa, you pretty much get you're able to pay with your local currency, and somehow in the back end, all the currency conversion has been figured out. So you just get a price that's listed in Kenya shillings, and you don't really have to worry about the currency conversions. So that would apply for Flutterwave, another payments partnership. That would apply for WapiPay, which also bridges payments, and also applies for M-Pesa. But what I have observed is, like, over time, there's been a lot of discussions. There's been discussions by about 14 central banks in Africa on having yuan-based reserves. So having reserves for the Chinese currency, and perhaps this would be something that would enable deeper making payments easier between our country and China for trade. So I think the currency issues you described, the currency issue you mentioned, is being addressed at the central bank level through trying to make the yuan a reserve currency. It's also been at the payments level. It's already figured out through some interbank type of systems. I don't think our currencies are really at threat from the Chinese currency. What I see is they are complementary because of the sort of trade that takes place between East Africa and China. So one way I've been looking at this is, I do think that you're going to see a lot more. I wouldn't be surprised when I saw the story about Mate 40 and the digital currency that's running on the Mate 40 that's based on the China's DCEP. In my mind, I'm trying to connect the dots and see, is there any way that's like a play to enable deeper integration of payments between Africa and China for the purposes of trade, So that's how I see it.
Yeah, I don't see it as a play between Africa and China for trade as much as I think that China wants to make DCEP. Just for those of you not familiar, DCEP stands for Digital Currency Electronic Payment. That is the digital version of the renminbi or the yuan that is backed by the People's Bank of China. So that is the key. And one of the key differences between the Chinese cryptocurrency and others, like the one from Libra or Facebook, is the fact that there is a backdoor in the Chinese cryptocurrency. That is a core requirement from the People's Bank of China, is that they can get access to monitor users' data. That's one of the differentiating factors between that and, say, an open source cryptocurrency or other non-Chinese, that is, it's impossible to actually monitor that. But I tend to think, and I'd like to get your reaction to this, Michael, that the Chinese they're going for a bigger piece of the pie. There's a battle right now in places like Africa to establish standards. And cryptocurrency is one of these areas where there's 55,000 different cryptocurrencies. There's no standard that's set yet. And they want to become one of 4 or 5 that will rule the world, if you will. You know, people are fighting for these standards on technology, on all different sorts of things. So with taking into account the idea that Transin has 50%, imagine getting into the Transin ecosystem with a DCEP cryptocurrency on the back end to facilitate some of the functionality on things like PalmPay. The user will never know that this is a Chinese cryptocurrency, but as you talked about, it just facilitates the transactions. That seems to me to be the prize that they're going to be going for, rather than just the narrow vertical of China-Africa trade.
Yeah, Erica, I would agree with you, because one of the things that I've picked up from Africa and East Africa is we have a very poor payments infrastructure. So unlike the rest of the world, like the West, where they had like maybe 15, 20 years to establish like a credit card payment network, in Africa, it's been the opposite. You know, we have very little credit card penetration. So the credit card payments infrastructure isn't as pervasive as the new sort of payment methods that emerge, such as M-Pesa. So M-Pesa is completely different from credit card payments infrastructure, because it natively runs on like a chip in your mobile phone, like a SIM card. So it's native to your mobile phone, and it has like a dominance of around 85%. And this has been really powerful in enabling the unbanked to quickly be able to have like a financial service they can access from their mobile phone without too much requirements on KYC signups.
There's a difference between it being what you called native to the phone, which is a chip built into it. That's what the new Huawei Mate 40 is doing with DCEP. It's got it built into the phone. And the idea there is that it's far more secure when it's built into it as opposed to running as an app. Is that correct?
Yes, let me explain. That is correct, because, for example, with M-Pesa is like a SIM card. It's like a chip that you can put in and slot out of your phone. The one you mentioned from the Mate 40 is different because it's embedded in the hardware, so it's not something that you can take out. And with apps are different. For example, M-Pesa is more secure than a payment application that runs on Android, because that chip provides some security that allows you to sign transactions. So it's like a key that you have that you can use to sign payment transactions. So with the Huawei Mate 40, when they have an embedded chip on the phone that can run a digital currency at the top, like at the application layer, it gives you a very secure way for someone to be able to sign and approve payments. Yeah. So I agree with you, because I see that Africa generally has this problem that they don't have this super great payments infrastructure. They don't have a standard that cuts across the whole region. Mobile money is very country specific. It's not interoperable across different countries. So if someone can be able to create like a new standard that can allow someone to make payments from Kenya to East Africa and just cut across all these differences in local currencies, which is what I think is happening with the cryptocurrency trend in general, and also with digital currencies, then they can be able, for example, to monetize some of these applications with even something like micropayments. So right now, sometimes a lot of us are using applications, but whenever you want to make a payment, the damn app asks you for a credit card payment. And what I have in my pocket is M-Pesa, is a mobile kind of payment form. So there is a disconnect, yeah? And if someone like Huawei is able to make something like a digital currency with the security of a chip to be able to work with like applications like Boomplay, with other type of applications, then we can have even new types of monetization models, like micropayments for music streaming apps. So you're right, I totally agree with you that these new kinds of payment infrastructure and payment standards are going to seep all the way to the top into applications like music streaming services, like video streaming services, and they're going to be able to enable Chinese companies or whoever can tap into that technology to monetize, and not just monetize, but even be able to monetize in new ways like micropayments, So I'm totally with you on that, Eric.
So, I can see, that there's massive potential for setting up this kind of architecture, particularly also on the back of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Who are the main players in that race? Like, except for the Chinese actors, which other international players are also involved?
With payments?
Yes. In this move towards kind of universalizing and facilitating cross-border payments?
Yeah, I would say Visa, for example, which is an American company. So Visa has always had a footprint here because of established relationships with banks. But they've also always had the challenge of competing with these new mobile payments emergence standards, And Visa has really had trouble penetrating into some East African market segments because getting a Visa card is it's more of a hassle compared to getting a mobile payments, and this is why a mobile money or mobile wallet, and this is why mobile wallets like M-Pesa, like MTN Money, like Airtel Money, which are like mobile wallets offered by telecommunications companies. This is why they've been able to be successful because they are really able to enable someone who's unbanked to quickly get set up with a mobile wallet. So I'd say Visa has had trouble winning in this market, and right now they have this strategy where they are working with, they're investing in like fintech startups. They've invested in Paystack, they've invested in Cheaper Cash, they've invested in MFS Africa. They also have this Pan-African strategy where they're doing a lot more partnerships. So they've almost changed their strategy, and they are a bit more open to working with younger, nimble companies that are trying to solve the cross-border Pan-African payments problem at the app level. So Visa is definitely also trying to assert itself and still remain relevant. I think the other type of international company that I've seen and one that I'm watching closely has been WhatsApp, Facebook, and Libra, because Facebook, WhatsApp consortium, they have close to over 100 million users across Africa. I think it's almost 150 million users. And they already have people who are using their platform for communications, for trade and commerce. But what they've really lacked is a way to integrate payments. And I think you can see from even other regions in the world, WhatsApp is being very proactive about signing up payment partners in some of these regions. So in Africa, WhatsApp is also, I do look at them as someone who's potentially trying to also unlock the payment standards, payments infrastructure for its own purpose. And I think Libra, if you noticed when they announced Libra was masked as something that could help the unbanked in developing countries like ours. So I'd say Visa, I'm looking at Visa as well. Visa is definitely someone who's trying to make forays into this market to establish themselves here. Facebook Libra, even though it hasn't yet launched, I'm aware they're trying to also find a way to get into this market. And I think Opera the browser, which is also Chinese-owned, has also been working to create like payment wallets within its browser in Nigeria and Kenya. So those are some other international companies that are also trying to establish themselves here.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the Americans, in part because while we talk a lot about the Chinese, obviously, on this podcast, the Americans have been very, very active. And you talked about Visa. Visa last year dropped $200 million into a company called InterSwitch. Stripe, which is a payment processing company in the U.S., very, very popular payment processing company. They bought Paystack for $200 million, making it the largest acquisition of a tech company in Africa. That's very exciting. So the American firms are very, very active. They're just not as active in the network infrastructure space and also in the hardware space the same way they are in the services area, which makes sense at one level simply because the U.S. generally is a service economy and we're not as much of a hardware economy. And that hardware is mostly owned, particularly in the The device is by Asian manufacturers in Korea and also in China for the most part. So, but just you're right, you brought that up in terms of the American role that's there. I'd like to close out our discussion in terms of looking ahead to the future. And do you have any concerns about the growing Chinese presence in the tech stack that you outlined in East Africa, or are you more optimistic about what the Chinese are doing? Where do you kind of come down in terms of thinking about the future?
So I really try to be objective about these issues because I can sit and look objectively and see why Africans would be working deals with the Chinese, because we don't have much options, we kind of have to take what's available, what's best for us. So I'm not too concerned about it. I don't have an opinion on whether it's good or bad. I just track it as a trend to see where it's headed. I don't think it's going to stop anytime soon. I do think the Chinese, just looking at this stack, I don't see how we can move away from this stack to maybe a more diversified stack with Americans and Europeans in it in the next 2, 3, or 4 years, especially considering the economic times. Our governments right now don't have much money. They'll probably bend over for any great deal that they get. So going forward, I think what I'm looking at is I'm looking at seeing how this digital currency, this Chinese digital currency, DCP, how it gets embedded into East Africa's digital economy. I'm looking at whether it could end up as part of payments, micropayments in applications. The other thing I'm looking at how the digital Silk Road, how that's going to impact this digital stack. I'm also looking at trends in China about blockchain. So China has this ambitious project known as the Blockchain Service Network that's supposed to have a domestic component and an international component. And I'm looking at how they could potentially export that to East Africa, because in East Africa I'm seeing some governments are considering blockchain for some of their infrastructure. So I'm trying to see, is there any way there could be any connections there? So, Eric, as someone I've kind of worked as a journalist, I try not to take positions on these issues. I just track the trends.
Well, we appreciate that. We really do appreciate that. Your insights are absolutely invaluable. If you want to find out more about what Michael's writing and reading, go to his blog, Kioneki, Kioneki, and I'll put a link for that in the show notes. Michael, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Michael Kimani, he builds fintech, blockchain, and digital currency products in Nairobi. He also advises East African governments on blockchain issues. And as you can hear, he is expert in the kind of the tech stack and all the different technologies as they lay upon one another to make the tech ecosystem in places like East Africa and the Chinese role in that. So, Michael, thank you so much. If people want to follow what you're reading and writing and also to connect with you, Twitter is very, very important to you. What's your Twitter handle?
My Twitter handle is @pesa_Africa, PESA_Africa.
And once again, we'll put a link to his Twitter and also to his blog as well. And I highly recommend it that you add it to your regular reads because it's absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much, Michael. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, guys. Thank you for having me.
Cobus, it's absolutely fascinating to talk to people like Michael, and you hear how measured they are, how balanced they are in assessing the risks and the rewards of using equipment like Huawei. And it is such a stark contrast to when you hear the discourse in the United States about Huawei from so many. I mean, it's just henny penny, the sky is falling. I think there are legitimate reasons to be worried about Huawei. I think, honestly, there's legitimate reasons to be worried about all tech. Okay, I mean, so and Huawei has not done enough to be transparent, in my view, on these concerns about security. Absolutely, but the way it was explained to me by a tech analyst in Johannesburg, and I thought this was a really good way of framing it. He said there's Android and iOS. iOS obviously being Apple, Android being Google, and he said people who use Android make a trade-off on security, because it's nowhere near as secure as an Apple iPhone. You're giving away so much of your data to Google and to others. The App Store is not as locked down. And that's a trade-off, because for a cheaper price, you get an amazing phone. But it's not as secure. And we know this was the same thing with PCs versus Mac, that PCs were getting infected with viruses and do get infected with viruses far more than Macs do, but you pay a premium for Macs and for Apple products. And not everybody can do that. And even those who can sometimes say, you know what, I like the features better on Android and on PC than I do on Mac and iOS. And I think that's a very similar debate between what we're talking about with Huawei and security, that the amount of features and functionalities that Huawei brings to Safaricom is enormous. And yes, I think there's an acknowledgement from IT professionals that there are security risks. But the risks that a lot of Africans are actually more concerned about is not coming from the Chinese, but from other Africans. And one of the things I saw was a report last week about how piracy and cyber hacking is coming within Africa is a huge problem. And so I think the range of concerns that people have about this issue is far more than the Communist Party of China. That's not to necessarily downplay the concerns that are legitimate 100% about the relationship between Huawei and the CCP. But it just goes to show that the interests in places like Africa are very, very different than those in Washington.
Yeah, I mean, kind of Africans are primarily, focused on trying to move forward as Africa, and of course the unexamined issue, I think that isn't mentioned enough in the Huawei discussion is that sure there might be a lot of concerns about Huawei and ZTE and other Chinese companies, but Western companies have proven very willing to work with authoritarian governments in Africa. They they facilitated kind of surveillance left and right. So so when it comes down to that, the case isn't that different.
And it's very interesting because I think you mentioned this point, and Jude Moore has also brought up this point, that it's not a choice for many African countries between Huawei and Ericsson, or Huawei Alcatel, Huawei Samsung. The choice is really between Huawei or nothing. That is the stark choice, because the Huawei equipment comes with the financing. And that's what really makes it different, is the fact that the financing enables the purchase to be made. And you've made that point on a number of occasions.
Yeah, and in the end, it also comes down to just kind of Africans just also needing to live their lives. Like the kind of the flip side of I think a narrative that is frequently characterized or frequently framed as one of domination, kind of like Chinese, the Chinese companies build the networks and then Africans are locked into a Chinese kind of internet environment. Sure, I guess, but at the same time, people need to buy stuff, right? So like, if you need to buy like 2,000, kind of COVID masks, you need to get it from somewhere. If you're in Nairobi and you can get it from China on, kind of on an efficient network where it'll arrive 2 weeks later, then if another network isn't in place to do that, then then there's nothing really you can say. Like in the end, it comes down to African consumers, and the thing is, only so far, only the Chinese take African consumers seriously. Western companies are still generally, in large terms, not involved. Like except for kind of like high, prominent companies kind of nibbling around the edges, like, kind of Spotify setting up in South Africa, for example. Like generally, like Western companies don't give a hoot about what African consumers want or what they want to buy. And that in the end, I think, that's what it comes down to.
Let's look forward past the kind of COVID era that we're in now. And we've talked over the past few months about a lot of changes that are coming. You and I seem to believe that the amount of Chinese physical infrastructure investment is probably going to go down. We've heard that from a number of different guests on the show over the past few months, that the appetite for big railway projects and infrastructure projects is just not there like the way it was, say, 5, 7, 8 years ago. That being said, we reported this week in our newsletter that Uganda is in talks with the China Exim Bank for $2 billion of funding of their standard gauge railways. So maybe there is an appetite, but it may not be on the same magnitude that we saw in previous years. And then we saw an interesting quote, and I forget who said it, but you really enjoyed this quote, is that broadband is the new road. And it leads me to think that the Chinese are going to devote more time, investment, and attention in Africa to focusing on digital infrastructure that will then align with the digital Silk Road that Michael brought up, this new peace cable, which is the Pakistan, East Africa, I forget what the C and the E stands for, Europe. That's this new big fiber optic broadband trunk that's coming in that Huawei Marine is laying down. The big data hub in Djibouti that is now built, that China Telecom, I want to say, or Unicom, it's either one or the two, now has as their major hub in East Africa as well. And so let's look past in the COVID era that the Chinese commitment to African tech is going to go up considerably, in my view, in part also because this battle over the standards. And I'd like to talk to you more about standards because this is one of the concerns that the US and Europe have about Chinese hegemony around the world, is in the new fight for standards, and cryptocurrency, as arcane as it seems to most people, to me is one of the areas that is going to be of really, really important to focus on.
Yeah, no, definitely. Because we're not only talking about the cryptocurrency itself, we're talking about the entire flow of goods and services between Asia, Africa, the kind of Indian Ocean Rim, community, and Europe. So it's all of the work of the BRI is touches on this issue. The moment if say a Chinese payment system becomes a standard, that will of course be essentially a kind of a machine to print money. It would like the profits related to that are massive. Keep in mind that Africa really is the only untapped emerging market in the world. So I can see that that a lot of people would be very, very kind of focused on trying to kind of push the standards in a kind of particular way. I just for me, my preoccupation is always is how African governments are going to be dealing with this, and how it's going to shake out for African consumers.
The speed with which this can happen is astounding. So here in Vietnam, which in many ways is a similar profile to a lot of African countries in terms of development levels, infrastructure, and whatnot. Just a few years ago, nobody used credit cards. It was a cash-based economy. And then in the space of 18 to 24 months, it has just exploded. I mean, it's incredible. And you go to the 7-Elevens here, and they have like 15 different payment options. You can use so many. I mean, there's so many now. And I think that's coming to Africa as well. And this is something Michael alluded to, that there's just all these new payment services that are coming into the space. And I think it's going to be a very exciting time. It's going to cut down on transaction costs. It's going to facilitate commerce. And also, interestingly enough, a story we're featuring in our newsletter today is about how it's going to be cutting out African traders in China. The middleman is getting cut out. And this is an interesting aspect of the Africans in China discussion that we've been having for so long, because people are buying directly from Alibaba and AliExpress in Africa, which is not a trend that I saw coming that fast, but it's starting to happen. There was this ridiculous tweet that came out the other day that Standard Bank was promoting AliExpress in Zambia. And I thought, that is just weird, And maybe it's not so weird that you're going to be able to go online, order something, and it gets shipped directly from China, directly to your house in Lusaka. And that is the world we're living in. And you'll pay, of course, with some of these new cryptocurrencies. So it's a new world, Cobus, and it can happen really fast.
Yeah, and Africans will be on it. Kind of this is the thing with kind of what we've seen over the last 20 years is sure they're starting from a low base and the systems are very kind of broken, and kind of there isn't a lot of cohesion between the different systems. But African consumers are very proactive in terms of adopting to new technologies. They just jump into.
Well, it's a young population. I mean, it's a population of teenagers who embrace this kind of change, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, and these are digital-first teenagers. There's no adapting to it. They are born in it. They're breathing in it. They're in it.
If a company like Amazon is still planning to deal with, to have people make credit card payments and then, and then having to deal with customs, there's a lot of these kind of heritage companies in the West. Like a lot of them, I don't think are gonna you're gonna make that much of a dent. I think the market is already pivoting, kind of in a more Asian direction. But I mean, I'm an outsider, so I'm not sure. But
fair enough. Well, let's leave the conversation there. This is going to be a topic we'll pick up again later in the year. Let us know what you thought. If there's particular aspects of the tech discussion that you're more interested in because it's so multifaceted, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach us easily. We're very, very accessible. You can find me at eric@chinaafricaproject.com. That's ERIC. And you can find Cobus, COBUS, at chinaafricaproject.com. We email back very quickly. And Cobus is busier than I am, but I email back very, very quickly with oftentimes some really long emails. And I love getting into conversations with folks about what they like, what they don't like, and topics and suggestions and things like that. So feel free to reach out and say hello. Also, a big thank you to all of our subscribers to our daily email newsletter. We're just so excited that it's growing and that you seem to be enjoying it. And if you'd like to become a part of our growing reader community, it's super easy. It's only $7 a month for students, $15 a month for everybody else. And you can go to chinaafricaproject.com/subscribe. Cobus and I are putting together this deep dive on all things related to technology, to politics, to geopolitics, to economics, the debt crisis, you name it. Anything to do with the China-Africa relationship gets consumed and gets published into this newsletter. And we do analysis on it as well. And that's why it's being read by folks in Washington, in Brussels, at the UN, in Beijing, at embassies around Africa and in Asia as well. So we're really excited about the audience and the growth that it's seeing. We'd love for you to become a part of it. So if you have any questions about that, don't hesitate whatsoever to give me a call. Or an email, actually. So that'll do it for this edition of the China in Africa podcast. For Cobus van Staden in Johannesburg, I'm Eric Olander. We'll be back again next week with another show. Until then, thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Head over to facebook.com/China Africa Project to share your thoughts on today's show. The guys are also on Twitter, where you can find Cobus at Stadinsky or Eric at Olander. And be sure to sign up for the weekly China in Africa email newsletter by going to www.chinaafricaproject.com.